Hey guys, so today's video is going to be a part 2 to the previous video I made about the Pokemon Super Nintendo cartridges. I actually made another cartridge at the same time as the other ones, and that video ended up being like over 20 minutes long, so I wasn't able to cram it in there. So I figured I would just make it its own video, and that is the first Super Nintendo Pokemon multi-cartridge. And I actually made this one utilizing an SD card on the inside, which I think is pretty neat. This will make it so we can switch between all of our Pokemon games on one cartridge, which I think definitely gives this modification more life and functionality. Now, I'm not going to cover the full tutorial since I covered that completely in the previous video, so all I'm going to do is just cover everything briefly until I get to what's new. So let's get started. So to start off, we're going to need a Super Game Boy. Like I said before, this was intended to be put on the last video, so I'm going to be recycling a few clips here on the tutorial process. Let's start by taking this apart by unscrewing the front of the case. Now, as far as a Game Boy game goes, I found one of those bootleg EverDrives on AliExpress for like $25, which is pretty awesome considering the price of a legit one. But anyways, the idea is to use this as our base instead of using just a single game cartridge. Honestly, I wasn't sure if a Game Boy EverDrive would even work on the Super Game Boy, but I mean, it is just a Game Boy game that has other Game Boy games on it, so it makes sense. Let's start by opening this up and we'll see what we got going on here. Okay, so the board pretty much looks like the others, except now we have pretty good access to the SD card slot here. Now the concept for this is still the same. The first step is we're going to have to remove the 32-pin connector on the Super Game Boy. Just take your desoldering braid and start working your way down those pads with your iron. Once all of the solder is properly removed, we should be able to slide the 32-pin connector right out, which will leave us with just the Super Game Boy board. As explained in the previous video, the Super Game Boy actually runs about 2.5% faster than the original hardware. Check out this clip of Pokemon Silver running on the Super Game Boy versus a cartridge I made previously with the corrected speed. So I think the difference is pretty noticeable, and that's why we're going to install a clock fix chip that will adjust the speed to where it should be. And it also opens up the door for adding a trading function to the cartridge. I should also mention that if you have a little extra money to spend on this, the Super Game Boy 2 already has these fixes done to it, including the trade port. But anyways, let's just skip ahead to the installed chip. Alright, so with the clock fix done, we can now focus on the Game Boy board and attach this flex adapter to it. You can actually do this without the adapter by simply attaching individual wires to the same connections, but the flex cable does make this a lot faster and a lot easier. To put it simply, it's just like a 32-pin extension cable. So let's begin by lining up the connectors to the pads on the board, and then you can just start soldering them into place. Skipping ahead, this is what the end result should be like for this. Now we're going to do the same thing and attach the other half of the flex cable to the Super Game Boy, which is probably the easiest part of this project, with the end result looking just like this. So now, the idea around this is pretty simple. If the games load off of the SD card, then all I have to do is just load my Gen 1 and 2 ROMs onto the card, and boom! We have the basic idea of the multi-cartridge. But before we continue, fancy case and label aside, this doesn't even have to be Pokemon. You could put all your Super Game Boy compatible ROMs onto the SD card, and that would pretty much transform this into a Super Game Boy EverDrive. On top of that, once we get the trading working, then you can use other games that utilize that port, like Tetris for example. So there's a lot of possibilities with this, and you can always take the case off later and add or remove games from the SD card yourself at another time. But yeah, let's continue on with the video. So I suppose the next thing to do would be to add the trading function. I already set this SGB link board up ahead of time with the necessary resistors and diodes, so all that's left to do really is just wire it up. You can cut yourself 5 pieces of wire about 6 inches in length and tack 3 of them onto the appropriate spots on the CPU. When that's done, we still have 2 more to do on the back. And now we just attach the other ends of those wires onto the SGB Link board. When that's all said and done, before we put things together, we should probably test out the trading function to make sure it works. So let's head over to the Super Nintendo real fast and we can see if this trades with a Game Boy. Okay, so I have the trade link port in. I'm connecting it to my Game Boy Advance currently. And you can see we're both in, so this thing does trade. Alright, so now we can finally start setting up the cartridge. For this, I decided to go with a nice, simple black case. I honestly wasn't sure which color would be best, so let me know what you think in the comments. But, just like before, we're going to have to trim this case to make the Super Game Boy fit in. I found this easiest to do with a Dremel, but just go over the necessary spots until the board sits nice and firm and doesn't move anymore. Oh, and don't forget to trim out a spot for the link port. Now, when that's finished, with the board sitting pretty snug on its own, all that's left to do is just secure everything in with some hot glue. We're mainly going to be doing this to keep the SGB Link board in place, so you can probably get by without using it on the Super Game Boy board itself. Now we can just speed run putting the case back together, and the last thing we'll need to do is just throw that nice fancy label on it from the Super Nintendo. So let me fire up Pokemon Red on the multi-cart and we'll test out the trading function before wrapping this video up. I just wanted to stop right here for a second and show you guys a quick clip because I think it's funny. It's not often that you see two Pokemon games on the Super Nintendo playing on two monitors side by side, but let me just skip on. Okay, so I have the multi-cartridge plugged in on the right here running Pokemon Red, and we are going to be trading to my other Super Nintendo running Pokemon Blue. Let's check it out. Okay, so I think that's about it for me, guys. This was probably the funnest project I got to work on in a long time, and it was honestly the first project I've done that's required this much soldering, so I feel like I gained a bunch of experience in this area as well. But I hope you guys found this video fun to watch, and I will see you guys in the next video. Adios.